Actually, what led me to write this book was a lifelong interest in Maurice Blondel, the philosopher, which began when I was a student. About 2 years after he died, I was in Belgium, and several of my teachers, had introduced him to us, and I actually wrote a licentiate thesis on Blondel at the time, which has never been published. And I've kept this interest in Blondel all along for two reasons, both because of he was very much in philosophy, like I was, and not as not in theology, and he was into Catholic philosophy, as I wanted to be. So, in a way that many people who are in fact Catholic philosophers don't care to be. Okay, so he was a very controversial kind of philosopher, both with the broader outlook on philosophy. Shall I call it the modern secular outlook on philosophy, which is what he was coming out of, and inside the church, because when he came out with his dissertation, in which he tried to make a point about philosophy of religion and philosophy of supernatural religion understood in the Catholic sense, he was acclaimed by Catholic journals, and he says, we finally have an advocate, in the university, the Catholic Church. And he replied, saying, no, wait a minute, you got me all wrong. And set out to show and argued against the way Catholics were doing philosophy, which was not good philosophy, or which, and so in fact, I shouldn't say good philosophy, it was not sufficient in the modern context of philosophy, what they were doing. And he even went after the Thomists, or I shouldn't say Thomists explicitly, he went after neo-scholastic manuals, so-called manuals in philosophy, as not cutting the cake, when it comes to modern philosophy. And so this fascinated me. I've always been kind of an aggressive guy anyway, and when I see he became an intellectual hero for me, in many ways. And my study in him, I translated a book, his most famous book, which was that dissertation in 1893. The translation was published in 1984. And my purpose in translating the book was so that I could teach it, because there was nothing of his in English. This book at that time had been translated in maybe 15, 20 languages, including Japanese, but never in English. So I was kind of doing something that should have been done much sooner, but also I was doing it because I wanted to be able to use the book in the classroom, and I still do. I give a course called Philosophy of Religion and Human Subjectivity, which attracts a lot of students who have the same kind of problem Blondel had and that I had as a philosopher. So anyway, my interest in Blondel, remained all the way through. And about one of the things that I noticed years ago, that nobody ever wrote a book on Blondel, the whole thing. The award that that mentions the fact that this is the first book, and I was very conscious of that when I was writing the book, that somebody's got to write a book on not just some episode, but on the whole life and philosophy of Blondel, in one stroke. So I sat down to that about 10 years ago, 8 or 9 years ago. And I just worked on that, till this Well, it came out in 2010, and I maybe had been working on it full time, writing, I mean, for about 4 or 5 years. The biggest thing that I had to face as I was writing it is I started thinking of it as an intellectual biography. So the first part is kind of an account of what he did, how he steps into the academic milieu as a philosopher, kind of out of the blue. There are no antecedents except in some indirect way. What I had seen was mostly interest in the early Blondel and the kind of controversies that he got involved with, and I thought it was worth telling this story. So the first half of the book is actually a narrative of how he got into philosophy, why, what happens with other philosophers, with other Catholics, kinds of controversies he got involved with, kind of students he had, disciples who became disciples of his, colleagues in writing articles for journals and running journals and things like that. He was at the same time a university professor, which means that he's the senior philosopher in charge of a certain region in France. So he was not only a teacher, but he was also a supervisor, the chair for the area. It was the supervisor for the teaching at the lower levels. And he always, in those controversies during the modernist crisis, I think I should mention that, he finally realized that what he was trying to do at that time was an exercise in futility. Okay, so he decided he wouldn't write about this anymore and started working himself on what he thought Catholic philosophy should be. First as an apologetics, but not even that, just for what he thought. And he started writing notes. He had a full-time job, and so he was involved in controversies with students, and with other journals, and then, with other philosophers. He was always very much a member of all discussion groups. He was a contributor to the famous Vocabulaire de philosophie technique, Lalande. This was built up by correspondence among the teachers of philosophy around France, and got involved in discussion. He was in arguments with the Thomists, with Maritain, and eventually, in 1930s, he reactivated the old controversy that went back to the 1893, when he wrote a series of articles on St. Augustine, pushing Augustine as a philosopher and not as a theologian the way the Thomists were pushing him aside all the time, and provoked a debate that lasted, maybe 5 years in French universities, in which there were three sides. There was, what he did is he provoked a guy who said, look, there is no such thing as Catholic philosophy, not any more than there is Catholic physics, he says. And so he argued against the very idea of anything like a Catholic philosophy. And other people answered, Gilson in particular, and people who were Thomists rather than Augustinians, answered also, well, there is, but only in the sense that there were theologians, Christian theologians, who did philosophy in the Middle Ages. Okay, and there was, that was a connection. There was a historical connection. It was not an essential connection between Christian theology and philosophy. So, Blondel ended up arguing against the secularists and against the Thomists, who thought that philosophy could only be, loosely called Christian in that it came from Christians. Okay, Blondel argued against them also in order to stand a position, to come out with a position that said no, a Catholic philosophy has essential connections with, or should say, religion has essential connections with philosophy, just as philosophy has essential connections with religion, even supernatural religion, which by definition is beyond the power of reason. The book just came out on that. Incidentally, if you don't have it, you should be sure to get it. On these debates that took place in the early 40s, somebody just put all these articles together in a sequence. It's a very good thing to do, I think. Anyway, I got to that part of his life, and by then he was no longer teaching. He had to resign because he was blind and he was deaf. And all these notes that he'd been accumulating for his philosophy were still a bunch of notes, boxes at the corner of his office or whatever. And usually that's all people talk about. They only talk about that. He actually produced, a number of volumes, a trilogy, 2 volumes on thought, 1 volume on being, and 2 volumes on action in the 30s, after he was blind, okay? And then he produced a trilogy on philosophy and the Christian spirit, which is what he was driving at from the very beginning. On what philosophy can do with the Christian spirit. And that's the kind of thing he had in mind when he was arguing for Catholic philosophy, way back in the 30s, earlier in the 30s. So he produced these books thanks to a secretary who had been a former student of his years before, who came to work with him. And she spent the last, he died in 49, so equivalently 20 years working with him, working on these volumes. So they worked on these volumes, these 2 trilogies, and nobody had ever done anything with that. And when I came to that, I said, I'm not going to just skip over this by mentioning them in passing. So the book got doubled because I said, we're going to go through these books, as the legacy, that Blondel built up to, in his own mind, and that he published. So it makes for very tough reading. That's why people don't talk about him too much, because he could not read himself even. He would dictate to a very loyal secretary, and he would because he was very vigorous in his style in the early writings. But the later writings, they kind of float around because he doesn't remember exactly the way he puts things, and and he can't go back and check it out and things like that. So it's like, to me, the really good philosophers, good systematic philosophers, everything is churning away at the same time. So he's keeping all the angles in mind that he wants to keep in mind. So his writing becomes very complicated and difficult, the way Hegel is. Okay, when these people are given a chance to go to Rome, they really roam, and they include everything. They're polyglots, So anyway, I came to write the book like that. I had not decided that it would be a long book. Okay, it became a long book when I made that decision that it would be more than just an intellectual biography of the early years. It would include, the systematic outcome, of those struggles. So I titled the book. The first part is called what? The Journey Inward. Okay, that's what I was thinking of originally. But then I don't remember what I called the second part, The Final Legacy or something like that. In the current issue of Communio, in which I have an article under the title Why We Need Blondel, and in which there is a translation of a piece from Blondel that has not been translated before. There is, just before this article, an article on the triumph of Blondel in the 21st century and in the Second Vatican Council and in the 21st century. And sounds, very abstract when you first read it, but if you look, it's really worth reading to answer that question. The legacy of Blondel, in the context in which he lived, was that he was influential in transforming Thomism, among other things. The people who got interested in him, there were some people who were opposed to him, especially among the Dominicans, but even among the Jesuits. But there were also some people, especially in the Jesuits, who became very interested in him and read him and got into discussions with him and were influenced by him. And the most important people that looking back that he influenced in this way were Henri de Lubac, Jean Danielou, that whole school of new theology. Now I don't think those people were ever Thomists, but Hans Urs von Balthasar, who has tremendous influence, and the point of that article was not to show just how he influenced them, but where the influence went and how it got to the Second Vatican Council and how it continues in the 21st century. So it's entitled The Triumph of Blondel. Blondel was suppressed, by witch hunters, church witch hunters. And he was very much afraid of that all his life. He would not allow his dissertation of 1893 to be reprinted even during his lifetime. As soon as he died, they reprinted it. And he did not want that because he was afraid that if it were to be reprinted, that would be taken as the occasion for having him put on the index. Blondel was a very devout Catholic, very loyal son of the church who did not want to do this. He knew he was not condemned by anybody, that counted. He had explicit letters from 2 or 3 popes. And Communio puts in a commendation from John Paul II in that same issue of Communio, where Blondel is featured because it's the 150th anniversary of his birth this year. That was their way of featuring him. So he did have a lot of influence. He also had a lot of influence on Germans like Karl Rahner, maybe on Pope Benedict XVI, I don't know, but certainly on Pope John Paul II. When John Paul II commends him, perhaps more than any other pope, he had read Blondel. Okay, I think he even taught Blondel when he was a teacher in Krakow, is it, in Poland? So he's had a lot of influence that way, and it's explicit. There's a whole school of thought, for example, that in England, still to this day, called radical orthodoxy. John Milbank, Connor Cunningham, and so on. I'm part of that circle because of my interest in Blondel. And what I mean is they invited me in, if you want. Blondel is, one of their slogans is a quote from Blondel, so he does have influence there. On the other hand, he does not have much influence in French philosophy, Catholic or non-Catholic, currently. I ask people who come from France, is Blondel still read in France the way he was when I was there as a student? And people say, no, not too much. So, but what I'm thinking is, well, maybe my book will do some revival of interest. Blondel is studied in is it Frankfurt? Anyway, there's a kind of a a center of Blondel studies in Germany. People who do some technical work on him, in philosophy as well as in theology. So he did have a lot of real influence with people who were essentially theologians. Namely, I think the most important ones are Henri de Lubac and Hans Urs von Balthasar. Indirectly, Henri Bouillard, who was a colleague of de Lubac, who's published some of the unedited stuff on Blondel, who was at the same time an expert in Barthian theology and things like that. So all these, a lot of these things come together, in the 60s and 70s while I was after I began teaching. And they lasted, into the Second Vatican Council. And the Second Vatican Council, I think this is the point of that article I referred to in Communio, is to say that, the stuff that Blondel launched comes to fruition in the Catholic Church, through people like de Lubac and Hans Urs von Balthasar. And de Lubac was made a cardinal, and all that, which, he was condemned before that, at the time of Humani Generis. When that came out, all these guys were put under a cloud, along with Teilhard de Chardin and many others. So Blondel, does come out. Most of the people who are interested in Blondel, I've directed doctoral dissertations here on Blondel, and they're all from students in the theology department. I'm currently, directing it, but one that's going to be terrific, I think. It's really good. But they're both in theology. I have no one. I've never had anyone in the philosophy department get interested, except that maybe there's one now that may be interested. I don't know. There's another angle on this that I didn't mention, which is the angle where I come in. I was doing philosophy in Louvain at the time, in the place where Marcel, not Marcel, but Maréchal, Joseph Maréchal, was a Belgian Jesuit of French expression, who wrote a lot of books and a 5-volume work on the point of departure of philosophy, which included everything from ancient philosophy up to modern contemporary Thomism. And these were people who, one of the things that was happening during the modernist crisis is that there were all kinds of clerics, including some bishops, coming down on Blondel. And there were other people who were trying to, get him out from under. Besides the Germans and the French I've mentioned, there was this school that I was a student at. My teachers were students of Maréchal and of another guy, Scherer, who in fact had been canned by Rome as a seminary teacher for Jesuits. And these two people were saying, what you're doing to Blondel, this young layman who had never gone to a Catholic school, they said, you're teaching us how to understand modern philosophy. This is very important. That's the kind of influence he had. And I think he also, influenced people like de Lubac and Hans Urs von Balthasar in the same way that he kind of showed them how you have to deal with atheism. You can't just dictate from on high. This is not philosophy. You've got to do it critically as a philosopher. I hope readers of my book will come away with the idea that Blondel is an important thinker, an important postmodern thinker, I want to say even, and that he is important both in philosophy and in religion, not to say theology. I have nothing against theology or anything like that, but I think it's important to keep religion as the overarching concept, because Blondel got to talk about religion because he saw religion as part of life. Okay, and his philosophy was a philosophy of human life. You could even say human existence, and this philosophy had to include the presence of religion, and not only religion in general, as metaphysics, something like that, but supernatural religion, which by definition is beyond the capacity of reason to understand. Okay, and so then that was the really original thing about his philosophy, okay, which nobody had ever tried to do, and which people, were scandalized that he, a lot of people were scandalized that they should even try to do that kind of thing, both in philosophy and in theology, okay, or in religion, but they didn't understand how Blondel was trying to affirm religion as a positive side of life, in the humanistic sense. Okay, it's the connection between the two that he wanted to maintain, and that you can't have a full humanism, okay, without having religion. Okay, now Thomists will understand that, but on the other hand, they do not see it as a matter of necessity for philosophy to do. Okay, they only say, well, you gotta allow for revelation. Okay, Blondel argues philosophically that in a way we need revelation. Philosophically, we can say that. I hope I generate readers, get into the kind of interest in Blondel the way I came to it at the time when he was fairly much part of the scene, in philosophy and theology, back in the 50s.